Rebecca Torres stepped off the transport van into a wall of scorching desert air and silence so complete it seemed to swallow every sound. The entrance to Thunderbird Air Command stood behind gates of reinforced steel, flanked by watchtowers and concrete barriers that shimmered in the relentless heat. She adjusted her duffel bag strap and walked forward without hesitation, her plain grey uniform already clinging to her skin. Her uniform bore no insignia, no rank markers, no nameplate, just standard-issue civilian clothing. She carried no visible orders, only a digital clearance embedded in her ID chip that made the gate scanner beep with reluctant acceptance. But what the scanner couldn't read was the secret burning inside her chest, a classified military background that had been deliberately erased from all official records just 3 months ago. Inside the base, everything gleamed with military precision. Rows of gleaming simulator hangars stretched across the compound. Personnel in crisp flight suits moved with practiced efficiency, and commanding officers swept past her as if she were invisible furniture. A towering man in an instructor's vest approached her near the intake building and barked, "Civilian supply deliveries go to Building C. Support staff doesn't wander near the flight zones." Rebecca nodded silently and continued walking. She wasn't there to make deliveries. She had been deliberately reassigned to Thunderbird due to what appeared to be a computer glitch, something she suspected wasn't an accident, but chose not to investigate. Not yet. She needed to understand what this place really was, and more importantly, what they were hiding. The following morning during trainee orientation, she positioned herself against the back wall of the Flight Operations Center. Multiple screens displayed complex simulations of multi-engine emergency procedures and lateral recovery maneuvers, most of which she had mastered years ago during her classified service. When the instructor asked about emergency cargo redistribution, during asymmetric turbulence, her hand rose instinctively. She barely finished explaining the solution before the front rows erupted in mocking laughter. One cadet smirked and muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "She actually thinks she belongs in here with real pilots." The instructor gave her a withering look and continued without acknowledging her expertise. Several heads turned in her direction, eyes filled with skepticism and amusement. Later that afternoon, while walking through the main simulator corridor, a group of cadets in pristine Navy flight suits blocked her path. At their center stood Brandon Mitchell, whose name was whispered throughout the base with a mixture of envy and resentment. He was the son of a decorated general and carried himself with the unearned arrogance of someone born into privilege. Without warning, he deliberately poured his sports drink across her lap, the bright blue liquid soaking through her uniform fabric. "Better get used to cleaning up after actual aviators," he said with a cruel grin. Cell phones appeared instantly, screens flickering as several cadets recorded her reaction, waiting for the outburst that never came. She looked down at the spreading stain across her grey uniform and made no move to clean it off. The liquid created a bright mark against the dull fabric, a badge that might as well have read outsider. Her expression remained completely neutral. She walked past him calmly, maintaining perfect posture. The laughter followed her down the corridor, then gradually faded into silence. By week's end, the inevitable memo arrived. Due to her civilian logistics classification, Rebecca would be denied access to all flight simulation systems. Instead, she was assigned to manage inventory documentation and assist with equipment routing. When she reported to the training facility, the simulator doors remained locked to her security clearance. Instructors barely acknowledged her existence. During training exercise reviews, she stood behind tinted observation windows while cadets practiced storm approach protocols inside full-scale mock-ups. She watched intently, mentally noting when one trainee overcorrected rudder alignment and failed the entire exercise. Nobody asked for her input. During meals, she sat in isolation, her food tray always organized but frequently untouched. Conversations at surrounding tables buzzed with casual cruelty. "Heard she's some kind of misplaced drone operator," someone whispered. "Maybe she thinks she's here to pilot supply trucks," another voice added. "Or maybe she's conducting some kind of inspection on our performance." Every comment was delivered within perfect hearing range, but none provoked any visible response. Her attention remained focused on a small, leather-bound notebook that never left her possession. Inside, she recorded patterns from simulator data logs, altitude parameters, fuel consumption calculations, performance metrics. Nobody bothered asking what she was documenting. Her uniform never changed, the same grey fabric, the same absence. Of military decorations, the same faded stain where the sports drink had dried into a permanent reminder. To them, it symbolized everything she wasn't. To her, it represented armor they couldn't possibly understand. The more they dismissed her presence, the more, she observed, every system vulnerability, every personnel handoff, every shortcut used by trainees who assumed nobody below their rank was paying attention. One afternoon, as the cadets assembled for an official group photograph in front of the base's central simulator dome, she was instructed to step aside. "We're photographing aviators, not administrative support," Brandon announced with obvious satisfaction. She stood just outside the camera frame, facing away from the lens, letting the desert wind pull her ponytail across one shoulder. She didn't protest, didn't speak, and didn't move closer to the group. What she did instead, quietly and with methodical precision, was continue observing the rhythm of base operations, the structure of their daily routines, the critical flaws they never noticed. But beneath her calm exterior, Rebecca carried a secret that would have changed everything, if they had bothered to ask. Rebecca's days began before sunrise and ended long after the tarmac cooled under desert stars. She worked in complete silence, moving between hangars with a portable scanner and clipboard, verifying cargo manifests against inventory stockpiles. Flight crews barely glanced up when she passed, and the cadets who noticed her presence quickly dismissed her as irrelevant. She appeared to be the quiet civilian who handled equipment deliveries and cleaned simulator equipment. What they didn't know was that she possessed advanced certifications in combat aircraft systems evaluation, credentials that had been classified and sealed under direct orders from Joint Operations Command. The computer error that routed her to Thunderbird wasn't an accident. Someone high up the chain of command had deliberately placed her there under a cryptic reassignment code. She had chosen not to challenge it because there were things she could learn here, even from the shadows. During simulator training sessions, she stood behind observation glass, completely invisible to the pilots inside. They called out commands, adjusted controls, and sometimes failed critical performance thresholds without realizing anyone had documented their mistakes. Rebecca documented everything. She kept her black notebook tucked inside her uniform jacket, its pages filled with columns of handwritten data, thrust-to-weight calculations, fuel offset compensation charts, thermal stress tolerances under combat, transport conditions. She never took notes during active hours. Only after lights dimmed and corridors emptied did she sit in the corner of the maintenance bay and write, her fingers moving with quiet certainty, each number committed from memory. After hours of silent observation, the isolation deepened with each passing day. In the cafeteria, her meal tray was always identical: a protein pack, dehydrated vegetables, a metal water bottle. She occupied the end of the longest table, the section nobody else used. Trainees flowed past her like she didn't exist. sometimes dropping half-formed insults loud enough for her to overhear. "Supply chain." "Barbie," someone whispered one evening. Another time, "Pretty sure she thinks she's some kind of undercover mechanic." She never looked up from her untouched food. The meals often went cold, but she remained until the room cleared completely. Then she returned to her documentation, her hand steady, her mind sharper than ever. Her sleeping quarters were located at the far end of the unassigned personnel wing. She had no roommate. Her bed was always perfectly made, her locker organized with military precision. A detailed map of the base was taped inside her locker door, marked with highlighter strokes indicating maintenance corridors, observation points, and ventilation access routes. She traced her own pathways each night, planning the next day's movement through Thunderbird with the kind of strategic precision nobody had ever requested from her. She wasn't there to fit in. She was there to understand what they were really doing, and why someone wanted her to see it. The mystery deepened each day. Why had she been sent here? What was she supposed to discover, and who was watching her watch them? On clear evenings, after the base settled into quiet, Rebecca walked the perimeter paths alone. Desert winds swept across the empty runway, scattering sand over concrete. The massive C-130 transport parked in the auxiliary bay consistently caught her attention. Its enormous frame crouched like a sleeping giant, scarred, battle-tested, and capable of incredible feats. The other personnel barely noticed it, too focused on their sleek jets and advanced simulators. But Rebecca understood the true power that aircraft represented. She had piloted its sister models during classified missions before the Thunderbird trainees had even worn their first flight suits. She could recite its backup control systems from memory, detail its behavior under uneven weight distributions, and troubleshoot its outdated pressure systems with her eyes closed. But since nobody had asked, she never volunteered that information. Her notebook grew thicker each night. Its pages contained more than technical data. They held her growing understanding of the critical flaws in Thunderbird's polished facade. Recruits who skipped essential pre-flight inspections, cadets who fumbled torque calculations during simulations, instructors who preached precision but failed to document system redundancies. She observed everything, recorded everything, not as evidence, but as preparation for something she sensed was coming. When Brandon Mitchell encountered her in the maintenance tunnel one morning, he gave her a mocking salute and said, "Still delivering spare parts. I guess someone has to keep the machinery looking pretty." She didn't respond, simply stepped aside and continued walking. He laughed as he walked away, but the sound barely registered anymore. His words carried less weight than the clipboard in her hands. There were moments, late at night, when Rebecca sat near the edge of the tarmac with her back against a power unit and her boots planted in desert sand. Stars stretched endlessly overhead, and the long silhouette of the C-130 cast shadows across the hangar wall. She sometimes reached into her pocket, touched the edge of her notebook, and closed her eyes. There was no pride in her silence, only purpose. The others didn't need to know her true identity. Not yet. She waited. She watched. And every hour she remained at Thunderbird, the gap between who she really was and what they believed her to be grew more dangerous. But Rebecca wasn't seeking justice. She was preparing for something bigger, and that moment was approaching faster than anyone realized. The emergency alarm began as a low-frequency pulse, dull and rhythmic, like a mechanical heartbeat vibrating through the base walls. Within seconds, it escalated into a full siren, casting crimson emergency light across every surface of Thunderbird's operations center. Voices crackled through communication systems, personnel scrambled through corridors. Somewhere in the background, a maintenance vehicle crashed into a security barrier and shattered its headlight. The sandstorm was approaching rapidly, but that wasn't what triggered the alarm. Two stripped-down M1 Abrams battle tanks had already been loaded into the rear cargo hold of the C-130, their massive weight secured by steel harnesses and rubber shock absorbers. This wasn't a training exercise. The tanks were desperately needed at a forward combat zone near the southern mountains, where an Allied Joint Operations Unit was being overwhelmed by an unexpected armored assault. The delivery window was just under 1 hour. Beyond that, satellite communication would fail, and the transport route would disappear beneath hostile radar coverage and dust storms. Initially, the atmosphere at Mission Control was tense but manageable. That changed in an instant. The two assigned C-130 pilots, both experienced heavy aircraft specialists, collapsed in the hangar within minutes of each other. First came severe dizziness, then muscle spasms, then slurred speech. Medical personnel rushed them away on stretchers. Word spread quickly. A malfunctioning radiation detector in the maintenance scanner had exposed them to a localized contamination leak during pre-flight checks. Nothing fatal, but enough to incapacitate them completely. The operations room descended into chaos. "We have 41 minutes remaining," the logistics commander shouted above the noise. 41 minutes until that forward unit gets surrounded. Without armor support, where are the backup pilots? They're en route from Mountain View Air Command. Estimated arrival? 4 hours, someone replied. What about flight instructors? Another voice asked. None are certified for combat-loaded deployment in this aircraft type, not under storm crosswind conditions. The sandstorm had already reached the outer security perimeter. Radar screens flickered with interference patterns. Wind velocity readings doubled every few minutes. A junior officer pulled up the emergency deployment roster and frowned deeply. We don't have anyone else qualified for heavy manual lift under severe weather conditions. Mitchell, the base commander called out, spinning toward the cadets who had assembled in the adjacent hangar. Brandon Mitchell stood with his flight jacket partially zipped and hands positioned confidently on his hips. He shook his head firmly. With all due respect, sir, I've logged 15 hours in the simulator with standard cargo loads. Not 2 battle tanks, that would be suicide in this weather. The other cadets exchanged uncertain glances but remained silent. One murmured, "We weren't trained for that kind of payload. It's beyond our specifications." "So nobody's accepting this mission?" the commander said, his voice hollow with disbelief. Nobody answered. The silence stretched like a taut wire, about to snap. The red emergency lights continued strobing across the operations center. Monitors flickered with cascading warning codes. Someone knocked over a coffee container near the radio equipment. Engineers in coveralls surrounded the C-130, shouting about static discharge near the rear landing gear and unstable cargo ramp hydraulics. The storm pressed against the base like an advancing wall of destruction. In the midst of the escalating panic, Rebecca Torres stood near an equipment rack behind the main briefing table. Nobody had noticed her arrival. She wasn't part of the emergency response roster, hadn't received the alert notification, but she was already present when the first siren sounded. She stood with her arms crossed, eyes scanning the live data feed on the largest monitor. Fuel flow calculations, cargo balance warnings, tail pitch drift measurements. She could interpret the overload variables instantly. Every line of code on the display whispered something achingly familiar. Still, she remained motionless. The commander paced frantically near the center of the room. If this aircraft doesn't launch, that mountain unit collapses completely. We lose 20 armored personnel, minimum. That's not a projection, that's a certainty. One of the technicians slammed a technical manual onto the table. We don't even have a ground taxi override prepared. The tank harnesses were pre-locked for transport. "It would take 30 minutes to unload. Then they're going as planned," another officer snapped. "If that transport isn't airborne in 27 minutes, we're calling for evacuation instead. We'll be too late to make any difference." And still, no pilot stepped forward. Brandon Mitchell stood near the exit, jaw clenched tight. His classmates shifted nervously. The room reeked of perspiration, burnt coffee and metallic stress. Nobody wanted to voice it aloud, but the reality was crystal clear. They possessed the uniforms, the ranks, the reputations, but none of them could execute that mission. Not now. Not in that aircraft. Not in that storm. Rebecca observed the unfolding disaster with a stillness that contrasted sharply with the surrounding frenzy. She could see the fracture lines forming between authority and capability, between pressure and competence. The storm outside wasn't the only one building to critical mass. 25 minutes remained. The screen displayed cargo stability margins falling outside acceptable parameters. The aircraft's computer system began recalculating safe takeoff thresholds and flashed red across every indicator. From the maintenance bay, the sound of howling wind echoed through the pressure ventilation system. Inside the operations room, silence settled like held breath. Then someone spoke the truth everyone already knew. "We have nobody qualified left." Rebecca Torres didn't speak immediately, not yet. But her gaze locked onto the monitor again, and her hand, steady, confident, closed over the edge of her leather notebook. The decision was crystallizing. She wasn't ready to announce it yet, but the moment was approaching rapidly, the moment when her real identity would finally be revealed. The operations room had become a whirlwind of desperate noise, not from shouting, but from urgency without direction. Alarms pulsed against the walls in steady, ominous beats. Commanders paced frantically, trainees fidgeted anxiously. The central mission control screen flashed another critical alert. Wind velocity surging beyond safe limits. Tank payload offset critically out of tolerance. Estimated launch failure window dropping below 18 minutes. Voices overlapped in mounting frustration. "There's nobody else certified on that aircraft frame. She's too heavy in the rear without rebalancing the trim. We'll lose lift altitude before reaching the mountains. If we can't launch now, we abandon the tanks, reduce the payload." Then, cutting through the chaos like a clear bell in a storm, came 4 simple words: "I can fly it." Every head turned toward the sound. The room didn't fall silent. It froze in stunned disbelief. Rebecca Torres stood near the rear entrance, just inside the threshold, where the last few officers had rushed through. She didn't shout. She didn't wave her hand. She simply repeated with quiet confidence, "I can fly it." There was a heartbeat of pause before the first laugh erupted. Then several more joined in. A wave of open mockery rippled through the crowd. One cadet near the control console barked, "Do you even know which end of the plane goes up?" Another shook his head and muttered, "I guess maintenance crew wings are a real thing now." Rebecca didn't blink. Her voice remained steady, authoritative, but almost conversational. "You have a malfunction at Section 19 Delta, right rear cargo seal. If it fails during flight, you'll lose all stability above 250 knots. The tanks need reverse harness configuration with crossweight distribution. Manual ballast adjustment can compensate for the differential, but only if you make the corrections during flight. Your rear payload sway calculations are already 3 points outside the safe operational envelope." Complete silence returned. Deep, thick, absolute silence. A junior technician, pale and moving quickly, opened a diagnostic panel and began typing rapidly. His screen illuminated slowly with cascading data. His eyebrows lifted in shock. "She's absolutely correct," he said quietly. Everything she just described is accurate. The base commander, still flushed from shouting, turned completely toward her. Who exactly are you? Rebecca Torres, she replied calmly. Field Evaluation Certification, Level 9, Heavy Frame Combat Transport. Cleared under Operations Directive Delta 7. The commander stared in disbelief, then blinked hard. Someone whispered, That's a Black Ops level clearance. Another voice from further back said, That's classified military authorization. An aide leaned close to the commander's ear. There's no visible service record, no personnel file, but the clearance authentication is legitimate. His voice dropped to a whisper. Sir, we have absolutely no other options. The commander exhaled like someone awakening from a dream. He gave the smallest possible nod. You have 17 minutes. Rebecca nodded once in return and walked toward the preparation corridor without another word. The room remained frozen in stunned silence as the truth began to sink in. They had been wrong about everything. No dramatic pause, no satisfaction, just pure purpose. Rebecca stopped at the equipment rack, selected a pressure suit, and pulled it over her civilian uniform with practiced military efficiency. Nobody moved to assist her. Nobody dared interfere. Outside, the wind howled with increasing intensity. The edge of the storm reached the security fence line, turning the sky to dark iron. She climbed into the C-130 alone, conducted her pre-flight. Checks manually, no support crew, no assistant navigator, just her inside a steel behemoth loaded beyond normal capacity. The engines spun to life, turbines roaring louder than the approaching storm. The aircraft crawled from the hangar opening like a giant awakening. The takeoff pushed every limit. Crosswinds hammered from the northeast, forcing her to adjust rudder. Control as the aircraft tilted dangerously. She corrected with minimal input, coaxing the massive frame back to level. At 160 knots, she pulled back on the controls. The C-130 lifted off the runway. Every second of the climb was a battle against physics and weather, but she held it perfectly steady. 34 minutes later, she touched down at the forward operations zone. Tanks delivered successfully. Mission completed flawlessly. Not a single component out of place. When she returned to Thunderbird, a quiet crowd had gathered along the entire tarmac. Instructors, trainees, officers wearing wind-blown caps. Nobody spoke. They watched the aircraft return not with celebration, but with profound gravity. Rebecca stepped down alone, her boots meeting the concrete with soft, grounded weight. The base commander approached to meet her, his cap tucked under his arm, his eyes reflecting something between deep regret and absolute reverence. He stood at attention, then raised his hand in a crisp military salute. "We completely misjudged you," he said, with genuine remorse. Rebecca didn't reply immediately. A few steps behind the commander, Brandon Mitchell shifted uncomfortably. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Finally, he took a hesitant step forward. "I had no idea who you really were," he said quietly, his voice thick with shame. "I'm deeply sorry." Rebecca met his gaze directly. Her expression didn't harden, didn't soften. She simply looked at him, 1 second, 2, then walked past him without speaking a single word. The weight of that silence hit harder than any response could have. The other cadets straightened automatically. One by one, they fell into formation. No order was issued, no command given. They simply moved, shoulders square, feet aligned, backs rigid in the desert wind. Brandon joined the line. So did the instructors, the crew chiefs, even the senior officers. They stood in perfect formation, not for a medal ceremony, not for a speech, but because she had forced them to see the truth. Rebecca walked the entire length of the formation, her boots echoing across the tarmac. She met each pair of eyes individually. There was nothing in her expression except calm understanding, no satisfaction, no anger. Only something deeper, a lesson they would carry forever. At the end of the formation, someone asked the question that had lingered since dawn. Will you stay here? Lead our program? Rebecca paused thoughtfully. I was never supposed to be here permanently, she said, her voice low but clear. But maybe now someone like me will be welcomed when they arrive. She turned without waiting for a response and walked off the runway into the soft sand that followed the dying storm. Her figure grew smaller with each step. Nobody followed. Nobody had the right. Behind her, the formation remained perfectly intact, held in place not by command authority, but by the consequences of their actions. And in her absence, everything began to transform. Before the next sunrise, she was gone. But the changes she left behind took root and flourished in revised protocols, in opened opportunities, in the quiet understanding that true strength doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it just flies. What did you think of Rebecca's incredible story? Have you ever been underestimated because of how others perceived you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from our amazing community. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible real-life stories that will inspire and amaze you.